So, ladies and gentlemen, we are moving through to the next of our sessions. A wonderful way, of course, to start our sessions here today. Our next set of speakers will be joining us directly here on stage as we move to our next element, which is innovative approaches to investing in smart infrastructure. And I'd invite our panel to please join us here on stage. Our moderator for this session is Dr. Jennifer Schooling, and we have the head of Global Infrastructure Facility for the World Bank, Teng-Grong Lu. We have Director of Mobility Department, Projects Directorate, European Investment Bank, Gavin Dunnett, and the Chairman of Gorpa Consulting Group in Germany, Martin Güldner. So if we can have all of our participants to join us here on stage, we will get ourselves underway in a very, very short moment indeed. So we're looking at infrastructure and investment in Europe and the world, and we're going to delve into what the impact from global and regional policies are on improving urban challenges and mobility in particular. So to outline our session, I'll invite our moderator to join us here at the podium. Please, a round of applause for both, all of our panelists, and for Dr. Jennifer Schooling.
Thank you very much, Greg, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great delight to be here at the FIDIC conference here in Berlin, a wonderful city that I had the great opportunity to spend a few hours looking around yesterday, so that was a fine experience. As Greg said, we're here to talk about innovative approaches to investing in smart infrastructure, and we have three excellent panel members here to explore different areas of that for us. But just before we go into that, I wanted to just reflect for a moment. Smart infrastructure is a subject that's very close to my heart because I run the Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction in Cambridge. And we're often asked, what do you mean by smart infrastructure? And we thought we'd better have a good definition up our sleeves. We came up with one, and actually it's a very simple definition. I think it's very easy when we think about technology and smart infrastructure to tie ourselves in knots about the potential complexity of these things. But for us at CSIC, the Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction, we define smart infrastructure as what you get when you use the digital to design, operate and manage physical infrastructure. So it's really just applying sensors and data analytics to our physical assets. And taking advantage of the great opportunities offered by the explosion in the ability to sense things and the ability to generate data and analyse data in order to make better decisions throughout the lifetime of our assets. So whether that's about what assets we need, how we design them, how we deliver them, or indeed how we operate and maintain them, it's really about making better decisions through the use of better data. And everything else is the servant to that. And if we think about it in that way, and we think about digitisation or smart as a process or a tool rather than a destination, then I think that makes the conversation rather easier to have. It doesn't mean that it's technically simple to do, and indeed the fact that the digital tools that we have available to us are advancing all the time means that we have to be flexible in our approach. But if we think about it as actually being about the data, then the technology in a way becomes a means of helping us deliver and manage and use and understand that data, rather than this sort of objective that we must reach for that's ever moving away from us. So I just wanted to sort of share that insight, because I think then what we start to think about is how do we get value from data for our assets and ultimately for the users of those assets, because really infrastructure is there to enable society. So if we're talking about smart infrastructure, we're talking about how we better deliver and use our assets for the broader benefit of our citizens. One of the challenges that we have in this, of course, is what does that data mean and how do we do this? Now, many of you will be aware that a year ago in the UK we had the awful tragedy of the Grenfell Tower fire, in which many people lost their lives. And actually, in many ways, you could look at that tragedy as a failure of data. Dame Judith Hackett, when she was doing her report into the Grenfell Tower fire for the UK government, made a number of recommendations. And she talks about this wonderful phrase, the golden thread of information, and that it was the golden thread of information that was broken at pretty much every process during both the design of the retrofit of the tower and then through to the operation of the tower and through ultimately to how the fire was fought. There was a lack of handover of information from one organisation to the next, from one individual to the next, and that actually, if we were much better at managing that information, we would have had much better, well, A, we would have avoided the tragedy in the first place, and B, we would have been able to manage it better. But also then, the response that came after the fire, where we had lots of both regional governments and local governments who have, for example, social housing assets, and they needed to worry about, well, do any of our social housing assets have this particular kind of cladding on them? Or even hotel chains and hospitals started to ask this question. And very few of them had the information to hand. So rather than consulting their information database and saying, oh yes, it's these buildings that are at risk, they actually had to go and visit every single building and make an assessment, and often send pieces of material off for testing. So again, you can see how if we had better managed the data and information about those built assets, we would have had a much more efficient and effective response to how we should take remedial action on the rest of the assets that might be at risk. So as I say, digitisation and smart is a process or a tool, not a destination. However, one of the challenges that we face with it, and certainly that I find when I'm having discussions with various clients, etc., in the course of my work with CSIC, is that it needs additional investment, and how do we justify that? And how do we encourage that additional investment? How do we understand what the potential value is? And then, you know, regardless of whether you understand the value, you've still got to be able to raise the funding, the finance in order to invest in it. So that's to some extent what our panel is going to explore today. And I'm delighted to introduce to you our first speaker, Dr. Martin Gouldner. Apologies, Martin. Who is the chairman of the GOPA Consulting Group, which is an international development consultancy. And they're based here in Germany. And Dr. Gouldner is a leading contributor in the industry debates over the effectiveness of aid and the need for regulatory compliance, and also the value that commercial consulting firms bring. And I think Dr. Gouldner will be offering us both some insights and some provocations. So, Martin, I would like to hand over to you.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to open our panel today. Why public voice matters. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, FIDIC friends, when I followed our conference yesterday, I have to check what is not working. When I followed our conference yesterday, when I was listening to the keynote speech of Mr. Strube from McKinsey, when I saw the videos and the presentations, I questioned myself, why is our industry still struggling to get the reputation that it deserves? Why are consulting engineers not considered as key players or innovators in the value chain, in the debate? Why are we so far away from the political debate? And you just heard it in the two keynote speeches. They didn't know what we are. They didn't know the word consulting engineer. They might know it, but not good enough. And that was my question. And for me, at least from my view, there is also one answer. Look, yesterday there was not a single human face on any slide. No citizens, no smart user, no stakeholder was visible. When there was a human face, it was an engineer, usually sitting in front of his laptop or had a helmet on a construction site. Is this how we want to present ourselves in a political dialogue? When we talk about, this is the slide I found yesterday. Oops. The meeting room without humans, only technology. When we talk about urban growth and mobility, we present our industry with technical slides of tunnels, bridges, highways, or construction cranes. When we are talking about digitalization, our message is we have to get better, faster, and bring more innovation. But we show only figures, we show only graphs, and we rely on, of course, big data and the need to use it. But let us ask ourselves, what is behind? What is the story we should tell? The story is behind each technical issue, there is a human. There is a human story, there is the society. And this has to be addressed much more if we want to be part of a political dialogue. So, message is, being in this conference, I have the feeling we are much too much eye-focused when we talk about the challenges. We try to explain the world, the digital changes, in a way that we are talking about disruptive technology changes. And we love this word, disruptive. But we are the only ones who love that word, to be honest. So, public voice matters. This is true for the past, but it's even more true for all of us in the future. Let me tell you why I come to that conclusion. My name is Martin Gölter, you mentioned this. I'm chairman of a German-based consulting company dedicated to international cooperation. We are working for international development partners like KfW, like the colleagues from the World Bank, from MCC, to name only a few. What we have learned in our work in developing countries over the last 50 years is that for every development, for every change management process, we need the stakeholder commitment, behavior change, raising awareness, and having a very good communication. When we rethink systems, in particular towards a more sustainable mobility, towards innovation, towards networks and systems, toward integration, to name only a few, the customer aspect has to be in the center of our thinking and in the center of our communication. Mrs. Lotta Moser a little bit explained also on this topic, to say we need the stakeholders in the process. Be honest, yesterday I didn't hear often the word stakeholders. Very, very seldom. So, what drives me for this presentation, citizen engagement and communication is and has to be the precondition for any successful infrastructure in urban mobility. Let me quickly go through some facts, what we have discussed also yesterday, kind of wrap up. What is driving the process? The world is becoming increasingly urban. In 2007, for the first time, half of the world population was living in urban areas. This will reach 60% by 2030 and close to 70% in 2050. In addition, In addition, the urban mobility demands are booming. Today, 64% of all kilometers traveled are done in urban environment, and this is to be expected 3 times higher until 2050. What are the consequences? Also was mentioned very briefly in our political keynote speeches. We are talking about the 3 Ps, the planet, the people, and the profit. And all will be affected in a very strong way. The planet by air pollution, CO2, emissions, noise, the ecological footprint. There's nothing to say more. People, traffic chaos, traffic security, quality of life. We are talking about quality of life. And of course, the angle of profit. because overloaded infrastructure, insufficient public transport systems has an impact on the profitability of our economies. Infrastructure investments in mobility measures like security, quality, accessibility, sustainability, long sense, are very much related to behavior change on the demand side. For example, to provide a public transport system without the willingness of stakeholders to change their behavior with regard to the use of individual cars will not lead to any impact. So behavior change should be part of all our thinking also when we are talking about investments needed. Even the perfect mobility system without stakeholder commitment will not be effective and lead not to any change of the political agenda. We heard it also in the first session in the keynote. The second driver of change is regulation. We should not see it also too negative. It leads to new, innovative, sustainable mobility solutions. We have here in Germany very much on the agenda at the moment. The problem of diesel engines and that cities or the nation have adopted regulation that the diesel engines will not be anymore supported or has to be replaced. We will ban them in cities. So change of behavior, stakeholder commitment, and regulations. That are the three preconditions which we have to consider for our discussion when we are talking on investments. What are the consequences for Europe? What is the European Commission thinking and doing about it? The policy discussions, the policy dialogue related to urban development have been going on in Europe over the last 20 years. And we heard also from our keynote speakers that we can't talk about a German policy. We can only tackle the problems of urban and new mobility concepts if you look to the European base. So in 2007, the first time an agreement was reached, what we call the Leipzig Agenda, the Leipzig Charter, which called for sustainable development in European cities with a goal to make cities more healthy and more pleasant as places to live. And Europe, and that's the normal way of Europe, was quite clever to bring up a lot of initiatives to support this process. And we as GOPER consultants, we were from the beginning part of this implementation process of this quite substantial initiatives. So we had, let me go to the next slide. So I like to talk about three important initiatives. The 2020 Civitas, the Sustainable Urban Planning Model, and the initiative of Smarter Together. All these initiatives focus on a dialogue on an open data platform, creating guidance and tools for cities. And a lot of these initiatives have the focus to create replicate models so that cities can learn from each other and replicate best solutions in the best way. This is only possible if you manage such an initiative in a very strong way with all needed communication tools. So newsletters, press corners, events, libraries, learning centers, publications, and all the set of communication tools are extremely important if we want to have a buy-in process of all the stakeholders. And we as consulting engineers, we should take use of it. We should look into these areas. Civitas is the acronym for Cities, Vitality and Sustainability. It is now currently 200 cities in Europe out of 31 different European countries are participating. And the goal of Cities in 2020, financed by the European Program for Research, is quite amazing. I want to... That's not really working here. The next slide is not... This is how you can... Okay, then the next is sustainable urban mobility planning. This is a concept very much in focus, not only in Europe, but also worldwide. And it's also interesting, and I wanted to present it here because it shifts the focus from the traditional traffic flow planning, from traffic speed, infrastructure, short and medium-term delivery plans to a sustainable urban mobility planning with a focus of people. People is the main message, and we have to address people. And this is, from my view, the importance and the interesting thing, and that's also a good initiative by the European Commission, or co-financed by the European Commission, to have a buy-in process to bring these sustainable urban planning, mobility planning, to be adopted in the law of European member states. Last but not least, I want to talk about Smarter Together. It's an initiative to find the right balance between ICT technologies, what we talked about this morning, citizen engagement, and institutional governance to deliver smart and inclusive solution. Also, again, on this initiative, partnering, being together and learn from each other is the key element. And we heard it also in the presentation of the keynote speaker. So this computer does what it wants to do. Too smart. Maybe too smart. Let me finish. And this initiative is based on some lighthouse cities, Vienna, Munich, and Lyon. And to add to this lighthouse cities, follower cities, like, for example, Santiago de Compostela, Sofia, Venice, Kiev. And they want to create a learning mechanism so that the cities can learn from each other on lighthouse projects and to replicate. Finally, we do not want to develop for each and every city a new concept. We want to learn to implement a learning mechanism to learn from each other, to be more efficient with pre-tested solutions for a better mobility planning. Let me summarize. Stakeholder commitment, data platforms, dialogue mechanism to learn from each other are, from my view, the precondition for all the investments has to be done in the sector. And we as consulting engineers, we should use that opportunity to be part of the debate and also to be smarter. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'm sure that when we come to the Q&A session at the end, there'll be plenty of questions and responses around that. I think it's a key thing that we must remember, that actually most of the time the people we're talking to are not other engineers. They may be politicians, they may just be citizens, but the Minister, the Secretary of State earlier on said something along the lines of, I was listening to the translation, he said something along the lines of, I don't care what the solution is or how you deliver the solution. I care kind of, what the outcome is. So most people aren't worried about actually the technical design. What they want is to understand what it means for them in terms of their ability to get to work or to school or what have you. Our next interlocutor is Mr. Gavin Dunnett, who I'm sure again will be provoking us into some thought. Gavin is Director of the Mobility Department at the Projects Directorate of the European Investment Bank. But before he went into that, he was a civil engineer working for APPROCHES, delivering transportation projects. So he very much has come from this very technical world where we speak to each other in the form of spreadsheets and data, and has moved into a world where he's had to communicate very differently with a completely different set of stakeholders. So I'm fascinated, Gavin, to hear what you have to say about that experience and what that means for us in terms of investment and funding of infrastructure projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all for the opportunity this morning it is still morning, to share some thoughts with you on this subject. I'd have to say one of the first thoughts I'd like to share is one that I had as I was watching and listening to the wonderful Berlin Girls Choir, and the thought which came into my head was, I hope that at least some of them will have the ambition and the opportunity to become professional engineers. Because, let's face it, the engineering profession still has a long way to go when it comes to diversity. Thank you. So, for those of you who may not be familiar with the European Investment Bank, it is an institution of the European Union that was created by the Treaty of Rome in 1958 with all the other European institutions. It's owned by the member states, and over 60 years has grown to become the world's largest non-sovereign borrower and lender, larger in fact than the World Bank. Sorry, Jason. This is what we do with our money. Last year we lent something like 78 billion euros to a variety of public policy goals, one of which, the second largest of which, is infrastructure. The largest, incidentally, are SMEs and support for the growth of the new economy that comes through the stimulation of SMEs. 90% of our support for investment projects is in Europe, but we also support suitable projects that follow European policies outside Europe. And I would like to talk this morning a little bit about smart infrastructure. Smart, unfortunately, is not a word that's copyright, so everybody can use it. It's been used for a long time, and it means many things to different people, I think. I've used here the sort of smart city definition that we heard of a little bit earlier. You can see that everybody wants to be smart, and it's not just about digital, although it's becoming associated more closely with the digitalization of infrastructure. There are lots of smart things that we need to do to have a safe and secure future. And all infrastructure sectors are affected, but if you don't mind, I will focus a little bit on what I know most about, which is the transport sector. So, in terms of transport infrastructure, what is smart infrastructure? These two pieces of transport infrastructure here are amongst the oldest known transport infrastructure in Europe. Both of them, as far as we know, have been serviceable for more than 3,000 years. The Archidiko Bridge is in Greece, and that was built by the Mycenaean population at the time. It's so smart that it outlasted the civilization that built it, in fact. The Tar Steps is actually a bridge. It's a bridge of stones, and it was created again around about the same time in the southern UK. What's smart about this piece of infrastructure is that when there's a bit of a flood in the river and some of the stones are dislodged, they're all individually numbered, so people just come along and put them back in place. It's a reusable infrastructure, if you like. So both of these, in fact, to me, seem like pretty smart pieces of investment. If I may indulge myself and take you a little bit closer to my own home, I was born not far from where these wonderful bridges cross the estuary of the River Forth in Scotland. The bridge in the foreground is a World Heritage Monument and was opened in 1890. The bridge in the background is a suspension bridge that was opened in 1964. Which of these two structures do you think is still serviceable and carrying its full operating load? The one in the front. And so, over a period of time, various problems have developed with the suspension bridge, which culminated in the decision that it had to be replaced. It's now been replaced by this third beautiful bridge of different technology, different type. And it's probably, I think I'm right in saying it's the only place in the world where you can see three bridges built in three separate centuries. But the question is, which is the smart piece of infrastructure? And will the new bridge be smart? Will it last for 100 years? The truth is, we don't really know. So what we can conclude from this is infrastructure is expensive. Therefore, we need to make it last for a long time. And if we want to make it last for a long time, then it needs to be flexible and adaptable. There are many challenges in the transport sector. We've talked about some of them this morning. There are many more. All of these require massive investment. All of them. So digitalization requires massive investment. Security and safety now requires massive investment. Urbanization requires massive investment. We haven't even completed our network yet, so that still requires massive investment. We're in the middle of climate adaptation. That requires massive investment. So where is this money going to come from? These are the latest OECD figures on transport investment. And they show a snapshot of about the last 20 years of investment as a proportion of GDP. So 2.2 at the top is 2.2% of GDP. They're grouped into certain regions of the world. Western Europe is on the left-hand side. It's never been fully explained to me why there should be such a diverse range of spending profiles in different regions. It's partly, I'm sure, to do with the fact that in some countries are still building their networks, other countries have mature networks and therefore are facing problems of maintenance and renewal, perhaps. But one thing we can easily see from this slide is that investment has fallen substantially over the last 6 or 7 years, since, in fact, the financial crisis in 2009. And this has created a huge investment gap in ordinary infrastructure. For want of a word that is the opposite of smart, forgive me if I use an American word, which is dumb. It's not intended to be pejorative, it's just intended to be the opposite of smart. So in fact, there's a huge investment gap for our dumb infrastructure, never mind what we would like to do new. So we then think about where the money will come from. Will it be private money? Will it be public money? Who has the money? How are we going to finance all of this? But we need to remember always that however we finance our infrastructure, in the end, somebody has to pay for it. And there are only two ways of paying for this huge investment that's required. It either comes from the taxpayers through the government in some form, or it comes directly from the users. Both of these methods of funding have their problems and their shortcomings, and they are certainly not an unlimited supply. So we are always going to face choices about how we use our money, which brings me to the idea of smart investment. We need to make sure that the money that we do spend on our infrastructure is smart. It's a smart investment. you will find an increasing number of challenges that you have to face as the world turns. There are many, many different needs in terms of the way the society is changing. Sadly, a new one has been added to that list, and with the tragic collapse of the Morandi viaduct during the summer, this has placed a very unwelcome, in some ways a welcome, spotlight on the aging state of European infrastructure, most of which was built 50 or 60 years ago, all of which is now coming to the end of its economic life at the same time. This is a huge challenge. Because the spotlight has now been focused on this, there will probably be an increase in investment in maintenance and repair and refurbishment, and you as consultants will have this opportunity to take part in this process. There are many, many different services that will be required as part of this. And when we do get the chance to build something new from scratch, whether it's replacement or greenfield, we need to think about making it a smart investment. Do we really need it? How long is it going to last? If it doesn't last as long as we think it's going to last, can we repair it? Can we change it? Can we replace it? Can we reuse it? For me, this is what smart infrastructure means. There will be many opportunities here, and many engineers will probably say that this recent crisis in infrastructure maintenance is a vindication of what the profession has been saying for many years, that there's been underspending in public finances for many, many years. We told you so. But of course, in the end, there are no winners in this situation. This is just a failure. It's a tragic failure. It's not only a structural failure, but it's a failure of communication. It's a failure of our communication, our ability to convince those who have the money that this sort of investment is essential on an ongoing basis and cannot be stop-start, tap off, tap on. The industry requires a lot of time to build up to a certain capacity. If the tap is turned off, that capacity disappeared. When the tap is turned on, it will take many, many years for the industry to reach that capacity again. Therefore, it's our job to convince those with the money and the power that we need to plan long-term for our infrastructure, and that this needs to be a step-by-step process over many years. And you can have an influence in how that decision is taken. We need to be more vocal, we need to communicate more, and we need to become involved in the decision-making process. We need to make sure that the responsibilities for safety are placed clearly in the right hands. And these organizations outlive the political lifespan of the people who currently have their fingers on the money buttons. It's our responsibility to think long-term, because for sure, those who are looking after the budgets will not be doing that. So this is the challenge for us. And as we go into this new period of the refurbishment and refresh of aging infrastructure, I hope that we will take the opportunity to learn from previous experience, because if we are able to learn from previous experience, that will truly be something smart. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gavin, for that very thought-provoking presentation. Our final presenter in this session is Jason Liu from the Global Infrastructure Facility of the World Bank. Jason's spent a lot of his time working with the World Bank and has really worked on quite a broad range of complex energy and infrastructure projects worldwide. And not just managing and closing projects, but advising clients on infrastructure financing, risk management and credit enhancement. So I'm sure he will have lots of interesting things to say to us about actually how we manage that process of bringing projects to fruition. Jason.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jennifer. It's really a pleasure to be here.
I'm also the acting manager for Global Infrastructure Program. It's a new program we established that includes both PIAF and the Global Infrastructure Facility. PIAF stands for Public-Private Infrastructure Advisory Facility. Both are trust funds managed by the World Bank. The main topic of this session is about investment. So when we talk about investment, the key issues are typically around the bottlenecks in pipeline of investment opportunities and the risk. The two facilities that I manage basically try to address those issues. First of all, the pipelines, right? We all know there's plenty of liquidities. A lot of money is from pension fund, insurance companies sit on the sidelines. But often the feedback we hear from them is the private sector don't see well-structured projects. They don't see well-prepared projects in the market. So they're constantly looking for investment opportunity for them. So that's where the global infrastructure was established by the donors, try to address the pipeline issues. And then the risk issues as well. Unlike EIB, our main focus actually is more on the developing countries globally. For that, for the private sector investment, when you go to emerging market, the number one issues are how the lenders or the investor can get paid. To address the issues, the short-term solutions, oftentimes people are looking for government guarantees, or the guarantees from multilateral development banks like EIB, World Bank, EBRD. But the longer-term solutions is on the upstreams, right? It's on the government regulations, good policies, stability of the government, the governance issues that we haven't seen. So PIAF was established to try to address those fundamental risk issues at the root level. So let me just go to that in details one by one to give you an introduction of the PIAF and the Global Infrastructure Facility, who we are, what do we do, how we connect to each other, and what does that mean for you. By the way, GIF is a kind of a superstructure in the way that it's closely connected with private sector. We have about 50 advisory partners, including major pension fund, insurance companies, industry associations, quality enhancement institutions. I'm very honored that to have FIDIC as one of the key advisory partners over the years. So this is the main topic I'm going to talk about. A quick overview about us and how we, about PIAF and the GIF, how we work together. PIAF is, as I said, it dedicated institutions, try to focus on institution buildings to mobilize private sector investment. Specifically, they try to address the issues to improve the capacity issues on the government side, helping them to improve their policies, help improve the creditworthiness of subnationals and the state-owned enterprises, help the government to evaluate different options, the quality of the pipeline that they have, different investment options for the government, how to procure the public services or infrastructure services, what will be the best solution for them, and also address the risk issue, help them to support the pioneering transactions selectively. So the two main functions, if I summarize that, one is help the capacity buildings, institution setup of the government in developing countries. The other part of that is help enabling financing for subnationals and state-owned enterprises. This is the key achievement that they have done. It's one dedicated global facilities, try to strengthen institutions, and about more than 50% of their commitment is in sub-Saharan Africa. They were established in 1999, so next year will be their 20-year anniversaries. They use consultants, engineers quite heavily to use them to help government building those capacity over time. Over the 20-year time, they have approved about $230 million. Those $230 million have mobilized about $17 billion in private sector investment or mobilization over the 18 years. Yeah? The subnational financing in the SOE or state-owned enterprise space, they have mobilized about $1.5 billion already in the last 3 years.
Here's the portfolio, quick overview. Currently, they have about 120 activities globally. Current commitment outstanding is about $45 million in 80 countries. Some of the examples that we highlighted here, including building the first independent regulators in the ICT broadband to help improve the ICT and broadband connectivities in Somalia, a fragile conflict states, so they can see that without the independent regulators, the private sector will not be able to get into the country, the sector. So quite pioneering, important work to help open the doors, pave the ground for private sector. The other work we cited as an example is Colombia. We have tried to help the government build a renewable energy auction program, help them design this program. Essentially, we expect that the first large-scale auction will help to secure 1 gigawatt renewable energy capacity next year. So just some examples. I can go to a little bit more details later. Talking about a global infrastructure facility, it's a parallel trust fund facility. One of the topics I have put here is from policy to projects, right? The policy is the PPIAF we try to do, help government to design a good policy. You build a policy based on the data, based on the studies. So PPIAF found a lot of studies, help the government, to come up with a sound policy, all that, and also help them with capacity buildings, create a conducive environment for private sector to get into the infrastructure participations. And the enabling environment is critical. From there, what does it mean for private sector, right? You still lack of bankable projects. So that's where a global infrastructure project facility come into place. So about 6 donors plus World Bank helped establish the global infrastructure facility in 2015, trying to address the issue that I mentioned earlier, lack of bankable projects in emerging markets. We have dedicated $90 million from the donors, try to help the government to identify, prepare, and procure innovative projects in a bankable yet affordable manners. Okay? The way we deliver is quite unique, different from other existing facilities we have seen in the past. It is essentially a global partnership platform that will bring together both the multilateral development banks and the private sector that I mentioned earlier. All the major multilateral development banks are our technical partner, which means that they are the implementing agency for us. They will have access to the resources, and we jointly implement the projects together. So since 2015, we have approved about 41 projects globally. The outstanding commitment is about $36 million. Those projects, if they all reach to financial close, which is not going to be the case, but roughly estimated we can mobilize about $40 billion. About half of that will be from private sector we're expecting. And more than 50% of the portfolio, we look at it, is in transportation sectors. Here we show the project preparation cycles through the upstream to downstream. If you look at how the project being prepared, what are the critical elements that were needed? This shows the steps by step what was needed, the project preparation cycle. You started from very upstream. You look at the investment environment, look at the investment regulatory framework. You move on to sector plannings, the project selections, the pipeline identifications. And then you move on to specific transactions, look at the preparations, structuring, and procurement of each individual projects. And then you move on to the financing and the credit enhancement aspect. This chart shows you the different instruments and the resources from the MDB's Multilateral Development Bank, what they can provide, and where the PPIAF and the GIF can help contribute in this process. Specifically in this chart, it will show you the other chart I showed you earlier, including the financing and the credit enhancement piece, that if you look at the pink blocks there, basically you will have the multilateral development banks loans and also multilateral bank provide the guarantees to help close those transactions. But on the upstreams, from the project preparation side all the way through commercial close, that's where the PF and the GIF can provide support. On the upstream, you will see the enabling environment, the capacity building with the government, pipeline assessment. That's where mainly PF can support. You may move down to project definitions, the specific transaction structuring design, and the help of the government with the bidding documents and managing the tendering process all the way through the commercial close and the financial close. That's where GIF can come in to help the government. A lot of times we rely on the consultant working with us. We have limited capacity in-house, so we'll use consultant quite a bit. Some of the examples, on PF side, they have approved this urban mobility programs, essentially try to help the capacity building for cities, municipalities. If I see the trend in the global mobility financing world, the big trend is the role of the subnationals, the municipalities. They are playing a very critical role here. Yet, in the developing countries, a lot of times they need support with the capacity buildings, with the regulatories, with the plannings. So this facility or the program try to focus on technical, financial, and institutional capacity building to help them to implement the PPP-ready urban transport projects. Some of the examples we mentioned here is the Sierra Leone, for example. Try to help them to help them improve the efficiency of the government-owned bus companies, to help them to look at the options to mobilize private sector participations. In Colombia, we try to help the government to look at ways to finance the last mile connections, help them to look at various studies to help with the metro line projects to expand the ultimate connectivities in the cities of Bogota. In Mozambique, we are working with the Mopolo cities, transport authority or transport agency to help them to build a capacity to find a way to better regulate the concessions and to plan the public sector transport modalities. In India, PF also supported the business model for electric vehicles for public transportations. If you look at it globally, about 75 or 80% in the Western world, the electric charge is based on the household. But when you move to the developing country, looking at China or India, we look at a different charging facility or charging infrastructure model here, because not that many single house families or the setup of the people's residential model is quite different. So you heavily rely on the public or shared charging facilities. So we funded studies to help them look at the how to help the third largest cities in India, which is Calcutta, to look at how to help them to anticipate the demand and manage the demand as they start to adapt or deploy electric vehicles. The key figure here is if you look at the impact on the utilities, for example, the future use of the electric vehicles, our study found that could potentially bring $11 billion to the utilities. Utilities in the deep financial troubles at the moment, this could help them actually cut the loss by half. So this is a kind of very important a trend that we're seeing. India just one of the examples. One of the things we try to do is to look at one country's, focus on that, and then to see how can we use the same studies and experience, promote the best practice or the knowledge sharing and the transfer to other developing countries. So fundamentally, if you look at the three things that we try to support here, is one is a shared connected mobility system, and also help them move the mobility services to a cleaner energy resources in India, and also try to help them to find efficient integrated land use and transport planning with the least environmental footprints and the impacts on human health. So the development impact of this support is quite significant for the city of Calcutta in India. So quite a few examples about the gift support. All I try to highlight here is the integration of the two trust fund facility between PF and the GIF. There's a different modality we can work together from the upstream to downstream. Upstream means like, the enabling environment, the capacity building, the pipeline assessment that I mentioned earlier, that the PF has been focused on. And then the GIF is focused on specific transaction, the program designs. We find that we would have the biggest impact when we work together. There's a different way we can work together. Either we can work in parallel. While we focus on specific transaction from the GIF side, PF can support the specific bottleneck regulatory issues, right, to help move the transaction to a finish line. We also can look at sequential support each other's. Have a PF come into the countries, help the government address regulatory issues first, and then we move on to the transaction and program designs and help the transaction move to the commercial close. Specifically, there are some examples here later. In the Ecuador, for example, the Quito metro line here, PF helped with the upstream financings, come up with a 4-year investment plan. And the GIF will come in, look at specifically how to identify potential ways to mobilize private sector to look at different financing models, either through the MDB's partial risk guarantee, or look at the asset recycling, how to help the metro line leverage some of the existing brown assets to bring in additional revenue to help mobilize additional commercial financing. So with that, I'm running out of time. I apologize for that. One thing I want to highlight that is, as I mentioned earlier, we use consulting quite a bit. And if anyone is interested in working with the World Bank, and go to the e-consultant of World Bank's website. So we look forward to working with you as we move forward. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason, and to all our speakers for some very interesting provocations there. Very shortly, we'll be moving to questions from the floor. So whilst Greg is organising his team of microphone wielders, and whilst you're all thinking of the questions that you want to ask, I'm going to take the chair's privilege and ask the first few questions. And rather unfairly, Jason, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. Obviously, notwithstanding your appeal to our consulting colleagues in the room for them to work with you, I guess a lot of the purpose of your PIAF programme is to help build in-country capacity to develop those sort of public-private finance initiatives going forward independently within the countries. And I just wondered, what are the key challenges that you find in doing that? And perhaps reflecting on some of your longer-standing projects, how much success you feel you've had, and where it would help, perhaps even with consultants who are locally based, to help deliver that better.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, the focus for us is on the developing countries. We look at some of the basic issues, right? So we work with the lawyers, we look with the transaction advisors, we work with engineers that help with the project design and also the specific transaction due diligence. On the upstream, we also help the government look at the sector plannings, and look at the overall supply-demand dynamics, and look at affordabilities, fiscal constraints, all different aspects. But we'll come to the specific topic when we talk about smart. Unfortunately, this is actually a new area for us. We are still behind the curve, trying to catch up, to be honest. And in the past, of course, we always try to see what are the best practices around the world, and from developing world in many cases. And one of our job is, to capture the best practice in the world and to transfer that knowledge to the developing countries to help, use those knowledge and expertise to help build the capacity of the developing country government. So the technology changes quite fast these days. So I expect that the learning curve will be relatively short. But it's quite important, right? So the infrastructure, as the government mentioned, it's longer-term assets. It's quite expensive. You have to have a forward-looking view on these things. Something may be the best practice or best technology today may outdate it very quickly, and we have to be responsible for the taxpayers' monies. So that's why the capacity buildings, plannings for the government are quite critical. That's I think the space that we can learn a lot from the private sector, from the expertise in this room as well.
Yeah, and I guess learn from the mistakes that we've already made as well as the successes that we've had in that area. Martin, did you want to chip in on that?
Yeah, I want to add, from what I have seen over the last years, the most critical thing and the biggest change is that nowadays working for the World Bank, for the international financing institutions, environmental, safety and the social standards, to be that the consultant is responsible to keep that on track is the biggest change. And when we are talking about infrastructure, and I come back to my topic, stakeholder involvement, when we talk about social standards, resettlement plans to get the acceptance that people moving for a big infrastructure project from their place where they are living. So this is, from my view, one of the key issues nowadays for a consulting company, service provider.
And I think just to pick up on that last comment about the sort of social standards, I think one of the great opportunities that infrastructure presents is to address the challenges around inequality. And from a conference I was at the EBRD last week, there was an interesting intervention from the IMF saying that increased inequality actually slows down economic growth in a country. And of course, investment in infrastructure can help address inequality. So that investment in infrastructure can be a catalyst for economic growth, but we've got to think about who we're investing in the infrastructure for. What worries me sometimes about some of the smart city, smart infrastructure discussions is that it assumes that this smart approach is a panacea for all ills, and if by magically applying digitalisation to our cities and our infrastructure, we will make everything better. But I think we have to make a conscious effort to address those social issues. Gavin, you talked about a number of issues. The one that struck me the most, particularly in the light of the Morandi Bridge collapse, is that we have, when we build infrastructure, we typically are building infrastructure that, like it or not, is going to be required to outlive its design life. In the UK, we talk about design lives of 100 to 120 years, so we'll probably end up operating this stuff for 200 years. That inevitably means that we have lots of infrastructure around us that is in a sort of ageing condition. But we often find it harder to justify or attract investment to address those challenges of the ageing infrastructure. I wondered, A, whether you agree with me on that, and B, what your thoughts are as to how we can sort of shift that focus, other than by having disasters, which obviously we'd all like to avoid.
Indeed, I wholly agree with that analysis. I mean, we face impossible choices when we spend a lot of money on a large piece of infrastructure. We know, and there's nobody in this room would not say that a piece of infrastructure has a fixed economic life. It's designed to have a fixed economic life. But we also know that as far as people outside this room are concerned, as soon as you build something as big as the Forth Railway Bridge, there is an expectation that it will last forever. And we need to address this expectation to a certain extent, but also we need to address our own hubris, to use a great Greek word. The idea that we can design something to last for 100 years into the future is just hubris. Therefore, we have to take a look at ourselves and say, if we are wrong, and if the technology doesn't work as we would like it to work, what is going to happen? And what has to happen is that the infrastructure that we invest in must be flexible enough. There must be enough redundancy built into it so that it can do other things and can be used in a flexible way, that it can be replaced when the time comes that certain components have run out. I'm always fascinated to see some of the old aircraft that are flying around. I'm not referring to the commercial airliners, although some of those are quite old as well, but I mean, there are aircraft flying around that are 150 years old. They're not the original aircraft that flew 150 years ago. Probably every single part of that aircraft has been replaced at some stage, or it may even have been created new with new materials and new technology. So the way to address this kind of forever anticipation for big infrastructure is to make sure that we can replace bits that are likely to wear out. And not only that, if we can't replace them, there must be a backup plan. So if it's so critical, if it's so economically critical and so safety critical that we can't do without it, there needs to be a backup plan. We should never build a single bridge to somewhere without there being an alternative way of getting there. And that should be part of our thinking and our planning from the beginning, is the acknowledgement that we aren't able to predict the future in 100 years' time. And I'm sure the designers of the fourth suspension bridge fully expected to last for 100 years. It's done 60, which is already a long time, and it's carried 4 times the traffic that it was anticipated to carry. But that in itself is a failure. They didn't predict that there was going to be a lot more traffic around in 60 years' time. And in the meantime, we also increased the weight of axles that were allowed to run across it. So in some ways, it's done extremely well. In other ways, it's not achieved its 100-year design life, never mind last forever. So we need to think about these things in a slightly different way, I think.
Thank you very much. And finally, Martin, you rightly raised the topic of our ability, not only our ability to communicate with people who aren't engineers, but also the necessity to engage with citizens and stakeholders and bring them on the journey with us when we are looking at investments in new kinds of infrastructure, particularly the ones that maybe are going to require us to change our behaviour, or that are invested in with an anticipation that we will change our behaviour, for example, a move from private cars to public transport. And I fully applaud that, by the way. There's too many examples of citizens not taking to things and indeed protesting against things when they're not consulted. I think the challenge often in projects that I've come across is that this consultation isn't free, and in fact it can be quite costly to do it well. You can't rely on just sort of putting a poll up online and hoping that people will discover it. You've actually got to go out and meet people and talk to them and take them on that journey with you. And I just wondered the extent to which you're finding that that is factored into the planning of major projects, and that it's costed into the planning of major projects, and how easy or difficult it is to justify that.
I think we have a dilemma, as you mentioned, the consultation process in our societies, but not only in our societies, in the Western societies, but also in the whole world, is getting longer and longer. You should not think that if we have a major infrastructure work in Nigeria or in Uganda, that the citizens will accept this. They also need a consultation process, as we do it here in Europe or in the a little bit more developed countries.
Sometimes.
So these consultation processes have to be based on a better communication strategy. So we need a different awareness in our society that infrastructure and the engineering work is made to support citizens. And I was questioning myself very often, why is it so difficult? Why is our industry so little recognized? And we might think a little bit around or over the borders to think, okay, look, my little son, 8 years old, he's playing Minecraft. And he's doing all this Minecraft of the whole, it is so fascinating. But he doesn't understand that this Minecraft is made by consulting engineers, by engineering people. So we have to bring our messages down to the youth, the young people. That is the starting point of all our communication strategies. And there we are too weak.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm sure there are burning questions from the floor. So, Greg, can you point me at this gentleman in the centre?
From engineering outcomes, with a background of working in Africa and Asia. I want to go back to Martin's very first point and last point about that we're not good at stakeholder engagement. My question is this: Are you aware of the Cost Infrastructure Transparency Initiative, which brings together the private sector, the public sector, and civil society to address the very high levels of inefficiency, mismanagement and corruption in the public procurement of infrastructure projects. And if you are aware of it, this is a question also for Jason, if you are aware of it, what do you think of it? And if you think it's working, what can you do to spread the word about good practice in this area?
Thank you. Martin, Jason, which of you would like to go first? Martin, looks like Jason's signalling for you to go first.
Yesterday, I liked one sentence very much. Lean, green, and clean. That is our mission, what we have to follow. And of course, it's sometimes hard to implement, and we are in dilemmas, but we have to believe that we have to have a clean environment. And in our development partners, like the World Bank, you have to support these processes. It doesn't come by itself. It's a kind of, again, commitment and type of education, talking about and setting the standards.
Jason, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, these days you cannot do a project, especially infrastructure project, without doing a proper public consultation. Communication strategy is extremely important. Engagement of the local community, education is also critical. It's costly. I don't have the exact number or average number, but you know, it takes time, and you know, all the infrastructure project more or less caught into some kind of political cycle. So there's always this push from the government, from the procuring authority to try to push the project to the finishing line. But you cannot rush on these things. You cannot take shortcut on these things because eventually it's going to backfire. So without the community support, you know, that's going to affect the long-term sustainability for the project. Also, even short-term, actually, if you get negative media, you know, the project will get derailed very quickly. In some cases, we see that again and again in many different places. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I gather we've got a question over here, and then maybe we'll go over to this side as well.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Stefan from your law firm in Denmark. This question is mainly directed at Mr. Jason Liu. We're seeing an increase in private capital. There's a lot of private capital, in particular, available in Europe, and with the inadequacies of pay-go pension systems, we're going to see probably larger pension funds going forward. Is there a possibility to tap into, in a greater extent, into these private funds? I think yesterday we heard a suggestion about making infrastructure investment bonds, for instance. Is this a potential way forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, if you look at it from an academic perspective, right, it's a very simple issue out there. If you look at it, you know, the trillions of dollars sitting on the sideline from the pension fund, from insurance companies. Globally, you look at their allocation to infrastructure, it's less than 1%. I mean, various studies point to that fact. Yet, you look at the infrastructure need in developing countries, globally, and not just developing countries, it's also huge. Yet, the money is not going to infrastructure. Why, right? You would think there is, you know, just make that link will logically make a lot of sense because pension fund, insurance company, also looking at, you know, steady cash flow to meet their long-term liability, and the infrastructure assets will meet the profile perfectly. That's why I think our political leaders, you know, my own boss also talking about from billions to trillions, right? How you can mobilize private sector investment to help fill the infrastructure financing gap. But the reality is the infrastructure transactions are complex, takes time to prepare. And if you look at the pension fund, insurance companies, there's two fundamental issues. One is these complex assets, they don't have the in-house capability to understand, you know, the structure of these assets, the risk profile of these assets, to do a proper due diligence, structuring, monitoring, evaluation over time. But also there's a regulatory concerns from the prudential regulation, from regulators' perspective, to what extent that they allow pension fund insurance company to invest or allocate to the long-term infrastructure assets. So there's some misunderstanding from the regulator perspective as well. there's quite a bit of studies from the rating agencies to prove actually the risk profile of the default recovery rate. If you look at a longer term, 15-year or even longer, from infrastructure side, they actually perform relatively better compared to corporate financing assets. So that's where the Multilateral Development Bank have been trying really very hard to to address some of these issues. One is to provide the data to the regulators to help create a conducive environment for the to encourage institutional investors to look into investing into infrastructure. Also, that's on the supply side, but on the demand side, also look at the assets, right? I mentioned earlier, the lack of appropriate pipeline, well-prepared bankable projects, and also help them to address the risk issues for the institutional investor, also critical. All these things need to work together, but it takes time eventually. People thought about, if you could have an infrastructure asset class, that will solve the problem easily. Well, that itself is a very simple statement, but to have the infrastructure asset class also going to take time. The solutions that we haven't seen because of the complexity of the infrastructure, these transactions are typically highly structured, very difficult to standardize. People try to, promote standardization. We actually also in the space try to promote that. But when you come down to specific transactions, you have to look at the local conditions and look at the specific transactions, to make the transaction happen. All these documents that I'm seeing are highly structured and heavily negotiated in the end. But that said, I mean, there are some common, some of the elements that can be, can be structured, standardized in many ways. Some of the, at least, some of the common terms and terms conditions that we've seen. The MDB put together a recommended PPP clause for contract clause for PPP transaction, for example. It's gaining more popularity among the government, among the developers. So over time, I hope that the effort from different parties will help overcome that as well. I don't know if Ghana have anything to add to that.
Thank you very much, Jason. We've probably got time for two more questions if I take them both together. So if I could have your question first and then your question second.
Monsef Ziani from Morocco. I'd like just to make a comment on the situation that we are living in developing countries. The presentation were mostly focused on developed countries. When you speak about smart infrastructure in developing countries, you have a very big difference whether the infrastructure is conducted by the government or whether it is conducted by municipalities. This last decade, in many developing countries, at least the ones who are organized like my country in Morocco, there has been a very good progress in the way the governments lead the projects. So we have assessment impact studies, we have what we call participative approach to include the final users, etc. But the problem is when the project is conducted by municipalities. We are unfortunately realizing that we have democratized too quickly some aspects of the governance, and these municipalities have no enough capabilities to conduct the project first. And the second problem, they want to realize the project they have a short vision term. They are here, they are elected for 3, 4, or 5 years, and they don't want to make studies. They are here, they want to deliver the project very quickly. So, for example, in transportation, in Morocco, we have been struggling with the mayors, with the municipalities, to make mobility studies before choosing where they will invest money related to transportation. And at the last, we have now a law obliging these mayors to have a mobility study before putting any money on widening roads or buying buses or things like that, which cannot be the smart solution for the city. Thank you.
I very much hear what you're saying, and I think it's not just an issue actually for developing countries. We find this in the UK as well, that local authorities don't have that capability and capacity, and I think it's up to all of us, whether we're sort of in finance or in consulting engineering, to address that. A final question from the gentleman there.
Stefan Hecker with Nippon Koi Latin America, and this is a question for Jason. Do you mind elaborating just a little bit on the type of guarantees that the GIF provides? You mentioned a partial guarantee, for example, for the project in Quito. So especially at the sub-government level, what type of guarantees do you actually have on the downstream end?
Sure. The GIF right now is focusing on the upstream, on the project preparation, program design, address various issues that, lack of capacity of the central government in planning, and also municipalities, deal with election cycles, all that. So we provide a concessional grant in some cases with all kinds of studies to help complement the capacity from the government side. All this is done through coordination with other multilateral development bank. In the longer term, we do have the other mandate to help with credit enhancement, try to come up with the first loss facility to complement the credit enhancement, the instrument that the multilateral development bank is providing at the moment. The Quito metro line example I put out there is just one of the options there. GIF itself at the moment doesn't have the capacity, but we can help the project company, help the government look at different financing options or options for credit enhancement, utilizing the existing instrument from the existing multilateral development bank. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jason. Gavin, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share, having listened to the discussions?
I suppose, rounding up some of the questions, I mean, we very much see ourselves in the multilateral development banks as the spreaders of good international practice. I mean, a number of things were touched on: environmental standards, social standards, corruption. All of these things exist. They exist in developing countries. They exist in Europe, sadly. So we're facing these issues on big projects, always will do, but we see ourselves as bringing best international practice with us when we tackle these projects on a case-by-case basis. And in terms of where the money comes from, just a quick follow-up on that. I touched on it a little bit in my presentation. It's true that there's a lot of money available. There's a lot of private money available. That doesn't seem to be the problem at the moment. There's more money than projects. Why is that, we have to say to ourselves? Well, one answer is that not enough good projects are being prepared, and initiatives like Jason's are helping to prepare good projects. But probably the bigger problem is that all of this is debt. However you look at it, it's debt, and it has to be paid back. And there's only two sources of paying back debt. I mentioned them: the taxpayer and the user. So we must be very careful about the extent to which we increase the debt burden of developing countries, and to make sure that they are fully aware that this is a smart investment. It's an investment which is economically productive. And this, again, is where we as international finance institutions can help in selecting projects and supporting projects which are good investments for the future of the country.
Thank you. And Martin, would you like to?
To pick up your point, it's true that the country, the community has to pay back debt, and therefore they need a proper business model to refinance the investment. And then we come to the first point. The proper business model works only if we commit our communities, if we commit the stakeholders to the investment to get the circle closed.
Thank you very much. So I think this morning we've heard some really interesting provocations that I hope have made you all think about your role as consulting engineers, and that it's actually not just to deliver a fantastic new bridge or a brilliant new sewer or whatever it is you happen to be building, but actually it's about making sure that the projects that we're involved with serve a need, and serve that need in a way that is both environmentally and financially sustainable for the users. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers for their very helpful interventions and Do so in the usual way, please. And I'll now hand you back to our MC to tell us what's happening next.
Thank you very much indeed, and a big thanks indeed to Dr. Jennifer Schooling joining us here to ably moderate our session as we head through towards our lunchtime break, which is exactly where we're just about to head into now. Please, ladies and gents, I would like you to take the opportunity over the course of lunch to go across and catch up with one of our exhibitors. If you have not already gone to see the exhibitors, please make an effort to go and through and see. Our exhibitors are an integral part of being able to put on the event at the level to which you are seeing it, and it is a fantastic way of being able to increase that level of partnership and relationship. Please make that effort in supporting the exhibitors and also supporting our sponsors over the course of this lunchtime break. So thank you very much indeed for that. You'll find them out here. You'll find them further down the corridors as well. Enjoy your lunch. We have half an hour. We have 1 hour for lunch. Don't want to shorten it too much. 1 hour for lunch. We'll see you back ready and rearing to go at 1:30 p.m. for Urban Connectivity. We'll see you then.